Welcome back to Is It Ableist? My name is Devin, and I'm so happy that you are back here with me this week. And if it's your first time, thank you so much for coming and for just being here and sharing in this learning and growing and unlearning and relearning of ableism. I appreciate it more than you know, and I'm so glad that you are here with me. And as always, as I say every single week, I am just sharing with you my thoughts and just things from my experience, but I always encourage you to go out beyond what you're going to see here today and out into the world and just finding new experiences, finding people with different experiences to continue your process of learning and unlearning about ableism. So without further ado, let's jump into episode number 13. So today we're going to be talking about auditions and communicating with choreographers. So what are auditions and why are they ableist? And how can there be ableism within communicating with a choreographer? First off, if you don't know what an audition is, for potentially people in our audience that may not be dancers, an audition is usually a process that you go through for choreographers or teachers or whoever it is wanting to see what your skill set is and if you fit in with whatever the end project is or the end goal is. So usually this is something like where dancers will come and collect in a studio. We'll usually have numbers, maybe turning in resumes or headshots, depending on the audition. And the dancers will all kind of come to the center of the room, learn some combinations. Depending on what the project is, we'll kind of determine what those combinations are, and then start going in smaller groups so that whoever is there running the audition or just there to judge the audition can see everyone in smaller groups and then ultimately make their decisions from there. Also now, in the new world, there are also virtual auditions that have been happening as well, and also auditioning or just hiring straight on without auditions via social media. So the face of auditioning is changing just like the world is changing as well. But I just wanted to clarify that for anyone who may not know about what the auditioning process is. So why is auditioning ableist? Well, it's simple. Auditions are usually based off of what you are able to do or what you are not able to do in the given moment. So it's usually based off of however you are retaining the choreography, how you're performing, what you look like. It is usually based off of what you are able to do and something that is typically about your physical appearance and what they're seeing in the moment. So this by default is ableist. Some other things that I want to mention that could potentially be some of the things that choreographers would be looking at that feed into the ableism of auditions. Things such as race and ethnicity, weight and height. And to kind of give like the umbrella term for things like that would be something that is known as typecasting. So are you the type of dancer? Are you fitting into whatever type to be able to be a part of this project? So this is something that is going to change and shift depending on what the audition is for, where you are, like location-wise, what's required. All of these things are going to shift and change depending on the audition. This is also going to shift and change the ableism within the audition itself as well. Now, going back to my very first video when I talked about the history of ableism in dance, specifically focusing on Eurocentric dance forms, there is an ideal body type in mind in the Eurocentric study of dance. And depending on what audition you're going to, a lot of times that passing down of that body type, which more often than not does not include a lot of disabled people, is going to be a factor in whether or not you are chosen for an audition. Now, I say that so that you understand that this is also something that's going to depend on what the audition is for. Is it a Eurocentric dance style? Is it not a Eurocentric dance style? And that's not to say that ableism doesn't exist in other forms of dance, but I'm just focusing on Eurocentric dance styles because that is what my training is primarily in. But there is ableism in all forms of dance, so you could encounter this in any audition. But speaking specifically about Eurocentric auditions, that ideal body type is going to be in the foundations of that audition in some way. And with that being said, that is going to make the audition inherently ableist because you have that foundation that was set in ableism, white supremacy, and also colonization. So what can you as a disabled dancer do to start to break down the ableism within auditions? Well, I will tell you firsthand, it's not easy. I am someone who has been in quite a few auditions, and in a lot of ways, I still haven't really figured out the answer to this question. But I'm going to try to give you the best advice that I can about how we as disabled people start to break the mold here, start shattering the glass ceilings, start showing up and really making these audition spaces more accessible, and with the ultimate goal that more disabled dancers will be hired in the future. So the first tip that I want to give is do your research. This is incredibly important. I cannot tell you how important it is to do your research on the auditions that you are going to, the people you're auditioning for, the company, the project, whatever it may be. Doing your research is imperative. And this is advice that honestly I would give to all dancers, no matter whether you're able-bodied or disabled. Do your research, whether that is watching their work online, whether that's actually going and taking class with them if that's available to you and accessible to you. That could be having communications with someone who knows the company or whatever it may be. Do your research on what you are going to be walking into. Also, if there is some type of flyer, information, link, email, whatever it may be, usually with auditions, there's going to be something that's going to tell you what is needed in this audition. So is it an audition where they're expecting you to walk in with your hair slicked back in a bun, tights, leotard, ballet shoes? Or is it an audition where they want you to come in with black tights and a black leotard? Is it an audition where you can come in your pajamas and they don't really care? Whatever it may be, you want to make sure that you do your research, because this is going to be really helpful for you and actually is going to give you some answers to questions that you may have in terms of whether or not you're walking into an accessible space, if there is space for this space to expand for you to be able to come into it, and just kind of knowing whether or not you're potentially encountering something that may not be safe for you to be in. Doing your research is going to be really important, and that's why I wanted that to be the first tip that I share with you. The next tip that I want to share is showing up and having a strong sense of observation. Showing up, this is incredibly important in terms of visibility for the disabled community in the dance community. If you all have not seen my last episode, which was the very first episode of Is It Ableist Conversations, where I sat down with Kayla Hamilton, please go watch that episode. It is incredibly powerful, and she just brings so much wisdom and knowledge. And one of the things that she said that truly stuck with me was that as disabled people, we have to show up in these spaces, for these spaces to have to show up for us. And I've never heard more like true words than that. And that is the truth with auditions too. And also, doing your research, knowing what you're showing up to, and also observing the space as you're in it is incredibly important as well. We do need to show up. We do need to be in these spaces so that these spaces can have spaces for us. And also, we need to be observant to see what is ableist and existing around us in these spaces, what still needs to change, and also to make the true decision whether or not this is a space that we want to be a part of, that we feel safe in, or if this is a space that maybe we don't feel 100% safe in, but we do feel like there can be some communication and conversation there, then you can make that decision as well. So that's why it's important to show up when you feel comfortable to show up, because the most important thing with this is that you have autonomy and you have choices. So if you feel comfortable showing up in whatever space it is and you want to show up in this audition space, do it. Be observant and do your research. The next tip I want to share is support. I cannot tell you how important support is in terms of going to auditions and just in general, whether it's support from other people who are in the disabled community, other people who are just kind of in your close-knit family. Support it's so important. It is so important in how we function in the world as human beings. And when you have access to support, and I fully want to acknowledge that not everybody does, that support looks different for every single human, and some people may have more or less support depending on what their life experience is. But if you have access to support, bring support with you. If you can have a friend go to the audition with you, or a few friends, if you know people that maybe know the company you're auditioning for, or maybe know the artist that you want to work with, have conversations with them, creating some type of support for yourself so that you can go into these auditions not feeling like you are stuck within individualism and ableism as well. That it's just you, that you are by yourself, that you're having to go through this process by yourself. Having support is incredibly important. There have been auditions that I have gone to that were unbelievably ableist and very hurtful and just not inclusive on any level at all. Was not a great experience for me, but I had some type of support system with me in some way, and it really made a huge difference in being able to get through these really difficult audition experiences. So if you have access to some type of support that can be with you or support you in other ways, please do that for yourself. It will make a world of difference. navigating through these spaces that may not have space for you at this current time, but should. My next tip is ask questions. And this is something that I want to talk about in terms of asking questions before the audition, during the audition, and after. And this is important because this is something that I have struggled with as a disabled dancer, and that maybe some of you all are struggling with as well. Of when do I ask the question? Do I ask the question? And could asking the question count against me? Here's the best answer that I can give with this, and that is that it's going to depend on every single situation that you're in, and it's going to be different. I, as a disabled dancer, have done all three. But the one thing that I will say is that not asking questions is not going to be helpful for you in terms of being able to start breaking some of the ableism down, and also in your observation space of what is the accessibility or the lack of accessibility that I'm walking into. If you're asking questions before, it again is going to depend on the situation. There may be more open lines of communication. You may be communicating with the choreographer directly. You may be communicating with someone maybe in the company who's like the company director, where you can ask questions about the audition, what things are needed. You may even be able to ask, are accommodations available? Is there accessibility in your auditions? And these are questions that really need to start being normalized to ask about auditions. 9 times out of 10, most people are not asking those questions. Why? Because the space has not been created for those questions to be asked. In my time as a professional dancer, I believe that there's only been maybe 2 times, maybe 2, maybe 3 times out of my entire career that I had conversations with companies or choreographers, whatever the case was, where I openly asked about accommodations or accessibility with coming to the audition. And these were with people that I either had previous relationships with or that I knew were working with accessibility in some way. And so I knew that opening that conversation was going to be welcomed and met from a very open and inclusive place. The majority of the auditions that I went to were not like that, and most of the time I did not ask those questions. I wish that I had, because this, like I said earlier, is a question that needs to be normalized. Can you accommodate a disabled person coming to your audition? Do you have any type of accessibility in your space? Why is it important to start asking these questions? Because these questions are going to give you some of your answers from the very beginning, before you even hit submit on that audition, before you even pack up your bag to go to the studio. The answers to these questions are going to give you a lot of the information that you are looking for. Because depending on the answers to these questions, it's going to tell you where this space is in terms of accessibility. It's also going to give you even more autonomy in terms of how you want to show up in this space, and if you even want to show up in this space in the first place. Of course, I encourage you to show up in this space if you feel comfortable to do so. But if you decide from asking those questions that it's not safe for you and you don't want to show up in it, you have the autonomy and you have the choice. So if I had any questions to suggest to you to ask before, it would be about accessibility and accessibility. It would be about accommodation and accessibility. So if I had to suggest any questions for you to ask beforehand, it would be about accommodations and accessibility, because that's going to help you with your own autonomy in terms of, is this something that I really want to do? And is this something that I really want to go to? Now, asking questions during. This is also something that's going to change depending on the audition. There are some auditions that I ran more like a class, and typically in those spaces, not always, but typically in those spaces, it's a little bit more open in terms of questions because it really is just like an audition class. But whether or not the space is open in terms of questions is going to depend on who's teaching and who's running the audition. There are some auditions where they don't want you to ask questions. They want you to watch and learn and do. And they are judging you on watching and learning and doing. There are some auditions where if you don't ask a question, that's going to be something where they're kind of like, why aren't you asking questions? Especially if they're watching you and in their filter, you are not picking up or you're not doing what they're asking for and you're not asking questions, they might assume that there's something that they don't connect with in terms of you not asking questions. Then you may have somewhere in between of ask me a couple questions, but don't ask me every question. It's going to shift and change with every single situation. This is where global accessibility is the goal here. I mean, global accessibility is the goal in general, but when we talk about it specifically in terms of dance and auditions, this is where all of the things that I've talked about in terms of teaching in a classroom, in terms of how to start making your classroom more accessible, this is where that becomes imperative in terms of the people in your space not being left behind, even in an audition setting. The goal of an audition shouldn't be, let's see who's going to get left behind in this. The goal of the audition shouldn't be to trick you, to mess you up, for you to fight and struggle without asking questions. And I strongly feel that a lot of the ableism within these audition spaces comes from this place of seeing who passes and who fails, and creating movement and things around who can get it and who can't, without any attention to language, without any attention to inclusivity, without any attention to different learning types in the room, without any attention to accessibility, without any attention to the fact that how you're presenting the information, without any attention to how you're presenting the information that you are judging could be affecting the outcome of what you are deeming as successful for whatever it is you are auditioning for. This is why asking questions is important. Even in those spaces where they want you to see it and do it, asking questions is forcing accessibility to exist in a space. It is also forcing the educator to be the educated. Ask questions even when it's scary. Even when it's uncomfortable, ask questions. And I say this to everyone, whether you are able-bodied or not. Ask questions. And if your disability brings the need to you that asking questions is how you are going to be able to find success in your own individualized way, ask the questions. There is no guarantee that your question will be answered, unfortunately, but asking it is a step forward in creating accessibility. Auditions are scary. I get it. I've been through it. It's terrifying. And there's always that impending doom of, if I ask this question, am I going to be pinned as the one who is slow or who doesn't get it? See, slow. Hello, internalized ableism. That language right there. But that's what I have personally struggled with as a disabled dancer, is if I'm the one that asks the question, is it going to show? Is it going to show that I have a disability? Are they going to decide that I'm the slower learner in the room? Are they going to decide that I'm not the smart dancer in the room? Is this going to be the reason, capitalism, that I don't get the job? Here's the reality. Maybe. For all the reasons that I just listed, maybe. I can't say that it won't be. It could be. And that's why asking the question in the first place is the start. And that is a part of the process of showing up in these spaces. So ask the questions. Asking questions afterwards. This, in majority of my experiences, is something that usually comes off to people as interest, but it also can come off to people as being overbearing, or some people may see that as that you are trying to force them to like you or to want you. Where does that come from? Well, capitalism, white supremacy, colonization. If you have a question, same as what I was just saying before, ask it. If you didn't feel comfortable asking about accommodation and accessibility before the audition, ask it after. It doesn't even have to be about the audition. It can just be about their company in general. Because this is going to give you information and help with your observation about how this space is in terms of accessibility. So to wrap this kind of up, ask questions before, during, after. Even if you only feel comfortable doing one of those, do it. That is how we start breaking in the accessibility of these spaces. The last tip I want to give on this is being open and being honest. This is a difficult one because it's going to change depending on every person and depending on every situation, because every situation is different. The reality is that a lot of disabled people, not all, but a lot, do not want their disability to be known for the pure fact of not wanting it to be held against them. And this is something that I have personally struggled with in terms of auditions. And ask myself, like, do I tell them? Do I tell them before? Do I tell them after? Do I tell them at all? And never 100% knowing whether or not, once I tell them, or if I decide to tell them, if that played a factor in me being hired or not being hired. You never really know. But a lot of the time, your disability can be the reason why you are not hired for jobs. And that is just me being completely honest about this. So this is why I have struggled with this and had a time period in my life where I did try to hide my disability. And I have talked to friends who still struggle with this and still hide it, simply for the reason of not wanting to be judged based off of their disability. And it's something that is difficult because I feel like most people in the dance community I feel like most people in the disabled community don't want to have some type of, I feel like most people in the disabled community just want to be seen for who they are and don't want to be treated unfairly because of their disability, and also don't want to be treated kind of like this fragile, almost like a pet. Like, we need to take care of you, we need to do all these things for you because you can't do them for yourself. It's a difficult thing because there's the potential for both to happen, where people don't give you a second thought because of your disability, and also where you almost become the poster child of disability, and people end up being ableist in the sense of thinking that you can't even do things for yourself, or wanting to potentially use you as this kind of symbol or this marker of, we're accessible because we have a disabled person. And I can't speak for the entire disabled community, but I can speak for myself in saying that that's not something that I want on either side. But I also speak from an honest place of divulging your disability can result in one or the other, or both. And I have personally experienced one or the other, or both. But I would encourage you as a disabled dancer to be as honest and as transparent as you feel comfortable being. If you are just like, I am disabled and this is my disability and I'm going to be open and honest with you whether you want to hear it or not, do it. If you feel like, okay, I'll tell you as much as I want to tell you and then I'll make a decision from there, do it. If you make the decision, I don't want to tell them anything until after they have already seen me just as my authentic self and they don't know anything, and then I'll tell them, do it. Or if you decide, I don't want to tell them anything at all, do it. You have autonomy and you have choice. But if you feel comfortable enough to be as honest and transparent as you can, be honest and transparent. Because that is another way of showing up in these spaces. But you always have autonomy, and don't forget that. So the last thing that I want to say in terms of ableism and auditions is that, in my personal opinion, the only way to start to change the ableism within these auditions is by educating the people that are running them in the first place, by disabled humans showing up in these spaces and not giving anyone a choice of whether or not you can be there. Asking questions, having conversations, and active listening are the things that I see in terms of being able to shift the ableism in auditions, changing the dynamic of let's see who succeeds and who fails, let's see who's better and who's worse, taking out those comparisons, taking out looking at people in terms of what their bodies physically look like. Just eliminating the specific body type, the specific technique type, these specific things that keep us in competition with each other and that decide who does and who doesn't have the ability to be in certain spaces. Now you're probably thinking, okay, this is an audition, this is my work, I have the autonomy in who I choose. You're absolutely right. You do. But the lens that you're looking through has the ability to shift and to change and to grow and to be more inclusive. It's still your work, it's still your autonomy to choose. But you can shift the lens that you're looking through. So the next thing I want to talk about is communicating with choreographers. So why is this important? Well, depending on what the process is of auditioning or whatever it may be, sometimes you may be communicating with the choreographer, the teacher, the creator, whoever, directly. And this comes with its own set of ableist foundations. And that's why I want to talk about this with you all today. So the first thing that I want to talk about in regards to this is having an established or an unestablished relationship with a choreographer. This is something that greatly affects ableism in a way that probably most people do not realize. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you have probably heard the saying of having connections is important, or you need to make sure that you're not burning bridges and keeping connections and all these things. This is usually what this is in reference to, is who you know and how it affects your career. And this is something that I think is important when it comes to ableism, because this actually does make quite a difference in terms of being hired and not being hired in general, but also as a disabled person. So what are some of the downfalls of this? The first one is what you say and how you say it. So depending on how you're communicating, it could be anything from a text message, an email, maybe a phone call, could be a Zoom call, who knows in this day and age. How you are saying something and what you're saying, unfortunately, can be the difference in what kind of ableism you may or may not be presented with. In my experience, having an established relationship with someone that I'm interested in working with usually results in me being able to say more about my disability and whatever I want to say about it. On the flip side, with reaching out to people that I do not have an established relationship with, usually resulted in me either not saying anything about it at all, or just saying something about it in a very, very generic, very basic way. Now, this is not the case for everyone. This is just what has been the case for me. And there's no guarantee what will happen one way or the other. But this has just been my personal experience with this. But in general, there's always a possibility, and this kind of goes along with being honest and being transparent about your disability. There's always the possibility that people will decide that they do or do not want to work with you based off of what you do and do not say to them. And of course, this is incredibly ableist, because what you do and do not divulge about your disability should not be a determining factor in whether or not you are or aren't being hired for a job. Period. It should not be a factor. But in this current day and age, it is. Another downfall is what is and isn't held against you. This is a big one because I have experienced this one on many occasions where I decided to be more or less transparent for one reason or another, and it was held against me in a lot of ways, whether it was direct or indirect. And what I mean by that is there were times where I was met with things like, well, why didn't you say anything before? Or sometimes I was met with things like, well, you said this in the email and now I'm not seeing that. Or, oh, you're doing this because you said that in your email to me. You know, things along those lines where what I did or didn't communicate in the very beginning kind of came back to haunt me. And this is obviously a very blatant form of ableism, and can be incredibly harmful, first of all, is incredibly unfair, and is a direct thief of autonomy of that person. And this is why this is such an issue in terms of when you're communicating with choreographers, because there's always the possibility of them holding something that you do or don't say against you if you are taken into their process. The overall downfall is that disabled people are not hired as much as able-bodied people because of ableism, because of implicit bias, because of assumptions, because of all these things that make up ableism. Disabled people are not hired as often, especially in the dance world, which is an ableist art form. So the next thing that I'm going to say, I want to start off by saying, is something that is also going to change and depend on the situation. But most of the time, in my experience, having an established relationship with a choreographer usually resulted in a better experience. Now, that does not mean that I was hired. That's not what I mean. I mean a better experience in terms of communication, in terms of transparency, in terms of accessibility, and in terms of conversations. That's what I mean by that. But that is not always the case. When you have an established relationship with someone, it's going to be better in terms of that most likely they know something about your disability. They may not know everything, but they know something. And so reaching out to them, having conversations with them is usually easier in the sense that you don't have to lead in with, so let me explain this to you. That doesn't mean that there's nothing left to be explained, but the initial, I have to tell you about myself, usually is a little bit different or non-existent. But that does not mean that ableism does not exist within these situations. Because when you're working with someone or reaching out to someone about working with them, and they do have an established relationship with you, that does not mean that ableism doesn't exist within their process and that you won't end up in proximity to ableism within their process at some point. And what I mean by this is that you may be communicating with someone who knows you and who has been around you, has maybe even worked with you before, but it depends on where their process of unlearning and relearning and dismantling is. They may say yes to you coming into their process and want you to be a part of it and are open and excited about working with you, but here is the reality. None of that equals accessibility. Let me just say that one more time. None of that equals accessibility. I can tell you from my own personal experience, some of the worst experiences that I had in choreographic process were with people that I knew. And I have no harsh feelings towards them. It's not anything like personal whatsoever. I'm just stating the fact that just because you have an established relationship with someone or even a friendship, whatever it may be, it does not equal accessibility. It does not equal their space being accessible. It does not equal their space being accommodating. That is all going to depend on where they are in terms of that and where they are in terms of their space opening, expanding, and including everyone. In some cases, I have walked into situations that were very ableist, but the person I was working with was open to me saying, this is not working, we do this another way. And so there was space there for things to shift and open for me to be a part of it, but not always. So the moral of this story is, don't take friendship or established relationship as accessibility, because it doesn't equal that. So I want to give you all an example of what I'm talking about in terms of communicating with a choreographer when you have an established relationship and when there is an open line of communication for transparency and for honesty, And then I want to tell you what the result of that has been. And I would just like to preface this by saying I did get permission from this person to talk about this story. And I strongly believe that if you're going to share stories, examples, whatever it may be, that you really should ask the permission of that person, especially if this was a private conversation between both of you. So I just wanted to let that be known. But I had a conversation with a choreographer probably about 5 or 6 months ago at this point. We do have a very well established relationship. We are really close friends, have been for a few years now, and I reached out to them about wanting to work with them in the future. Just, whatever that looked like or potentially could look like. And when I reached out to them, it was via email, and I was the most open and honest I'd ever been in my entire career. And when I say open and honest, I mean I did not hold anything back. I was completely transparent. I talked about what my needs were in terms of my disability. I talked about what some of the communications and the things that would need to happen during choreographic process. I talked about how it would potentially challenge their process. I also talked about that I completely understand that not every process is accessible and accommodating enough for me to be a part of it. So I was very, very straightforward. I was very, very honest with this person because I knew that I could be, because we had an established relationship, and because I knew that I could say all of these things very openly, and that most likely, I'm not going to say 100% because the truth of the matter is you can't 100% know if what you're saying is influencing, who you're talking to one way or the other. So I'm going to say that I was 99% sure that my honesty and my transparency with this person was not going to be the determining factor of whether or not the answer was yes or no. Now, I want to say again, this is just one example. This is just one conversation with one person, and it doesn't represent everyone at all. This is just one conversation. In reply back, the answer was something to the effect of that there is space. I don't really know what that looks like. I don't completely understand, but I'm open to being in a process with you, regardless of not really completely understanding what that looks like. And there were some other communications about like some kind of logistical things, but ultimately it was kind of this thing of let's just see what ends up happening in the future. Not a yes, totally yes, or a no, absolutely not, or a maybe kind of sort of, which we all know maybe means no. It was more of a thing of like, I'm not entirely sure. I don't believe that your disability would be a hindrance to my process. I'm open to seeing what it could possibly be. So let's just be open. And with having an established relationship with this person, I kind of understand what that means. That meant for me that there's nothing like official at the moment. There's not really any type of establish this or establish that right now, but there's space. For me, the answer to that communication was there is space, and I'm open to seeing what that space looks like. Now, again, this was one communication with one person that I do have an established relationship with. But I want to say again that even with having a communication like that, that doesn't mean that that equals accessibility or that that equals a space where ableism doesn't exist. That's not what that means. That means that there is space for conversation. There's space for transparency. How do I know that? Because of the questions and the transparency that I came into that conversation with. So I know that I can ask questions. I know that I can be transparent about something that's not working or trying to figure out different things. And I know that I can have those things existing within the space because of how our communication went from there. But that doesn't mean that ableism wouldn't present itself in that space. So I wanted to give you all that example just so that you can have one. Now, like I said at the beginning of this example, that was the first time in my career that I had ever been that transparent. There's a couple other times where I've been close to that transparent, but not as transparent as I was then. And for all the reasons that I just discussed earlier in this video. Usually what I would do, if I'm talking to someone I don't have an established relationship with, is that I'm honest about my disability. I ask questions in terms of accessibility, in the sense of that these are the things that I usually need in a dance space. How does that exist in your space? Can it exist in your space? I usually ask things in that way. There's not like a wrong way or right way that I can tell you on how you approach your conversations when you're communicating with a choreographer. That's entirely up to you. For me, I tend to let them know kind of more in just like a matter-of-fact way. I don't usually go into details of my visual impairment unless I feel like it's really necessary, but I usually talk more about these are the things I usually need in a dance space. And then we kind of go from there. But honestly, it's all going to depend on the situation, who you're communicating with, who you're auditioning for, who the company is, how much research you've done. All of these things that I've talked about are going to be a big factor in starting to dismantle the ableism within auditions and communicating with choreographers. So I hope that this video has been helpful for you all. Thank you again if you have been coming every single week to watch my videos, and even if this is your first video, thank you to you too. This is how all of this starts. This is how we start having these conversations and unlearning and relearning and dismantling ableism. And as always, I post every single Friday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be posting early this week because, as I mentioned in an earlier video, I will be having surgery, so I will actually be posting on Thursday. So be on the lookout for this video on Thursday, and also be on the lookout. Oh no, I didn't need to say that in this video. Just kidding. Wrong video. But also be on the lookout for next week's video, which is going to be a sibling video to this one, where I'm going to be talking about this from the perspective of the auditioner, the choreographer, the teacher, whoever who is running the audition. So please be sure to watch this video and that video to get perspectives from both sides. So thank you again for being here with me, and I will see you all next week. Bye.